Assalamu alaikum and good day. I am Jehan Bashir and I'm going to discuss to you about The Rise of English by Terry Eagleton. Now, Terry Eagleton was born on the 22nd day of February 1943 in a working-class Catholic family. He is an English literary theorist, critic, and public intellectual. He began publishing in 1966 and is currently a distinguished professor of English literature at the Lancaster University. His first book, The New Left Church, published in 1966, attempts to reconcile Roman Catholicism with socialist humanism. Moreover, one of his important works, The Shakespeare and Society, published in 1967, treats Shakespeare's works as inseparable from fundamental social issues. And finally, he is best known for his most popular book entitled The Literary Theory and Introduction, which was published in 1983. So in this lesson, I am going to discuss about the rise of English, which was found in the first chapter of Eagleton's Literary Theory and Introduction. So the rise of English is an outstanding essay where Eagleton surveys how the concept of literature as we understand today has developed, how its studies have begun academically, and how literary criticism in English has evolved. He discloses the capitalist motive behind using English as an academic discipline in British colonies. As a postmodern theorist, Eagleton elaborately discusses the drawbacks of new criticism and paves the way forward to look at the literary texts with newer insight. Furthermore, in his essay, Eagleton criticizes the theoretical development in the English up to the new criticism phase. Now, starting from the evolution on the modern concept of literature during the Romantic Age, in the 18th century England, the concept of literature was not confined, as it sometimes is today, to creative or imaginative writing. It meant the whole body of valued writing in society, which includes philosophy, history, essays, and letters, as well as poems. What made a text literary was not whether it was fictional, but whether it conformed to certain standards of polite letters. So the criteria of what counted as literature, in other words, were frankly ideological. That is, the writings which embodied the values and tastes of a particular social class are qualified as literature. In the 18th century, however, literature did more than embody certain social values. It was a vital instrument for their deeper entrenchment and wider dissemination. It included a whole set of ideological institutions such as periodicals, coffee houses, social and aesthetic treatises, sermons, classical translations, guidebooks to manners and morals. Furthermore, poetry comes to mean a good deal more than verse. The word poetry then no longer refers simply to a technical mode of writing, but rather it has deep social, political, and philosophical implications. Now, by the time of the Romantic period, literature was becoming virtually synonymous with imaginative. The word imaginative contains an ambiguity suggestive of this attitude. It has a resonance of the descriptive term imaginary, meaning literally untrue, but is also, of course, an evaluative term meaning visionary or inventive. Now, this period, the Romantic Age, sees the rise of modern aesthetics or the philosophy of art. It is mainly from this era that we inherit our contemporary ideas of the symbol and aesthetic experience, of aesthetic harmony, and the unique nature of the artifact. Now, previously, men and women had written poems, staged plays, or painted pictures for a variety of purposes, while others had read, watched, or viewed them in a variety of ways. Now, these concrete, historically variable practices were being subsumed into some special mysterious faculty known as the aesthetic. Now, moving on to the literature in the Victorian age, which is characterized by the failure of religion, literature in the meaning of the word we have inherited is an ideology. By the mid-Victorian period, this traditionally reliable, immensely powerful ideological form was in deep trouble. It was no longer winning the hearts and minds of the masses, and under the twin impacts of scientific discovery and social change, its previous unquestioned dominance was in danger of evaporating. This was particularly worrying for the Victorian ruling class because religion is, for all kinds of reasons, an extremely effective form of ideological control. It provides an excellent social cement encompassing pious peasant, enlightened middle-class, liberal, and theological intellectual in a single organization. Its ideological power lies in its capacity to materialize beliefs as practices. Now, to elaborate further the relationship between English literature and religion, religion is considered a pacifying influence fostering meekness, self-sacrifice, and the contemplative inner life. Early professor of English literature at Oxford, George Gordon, commented in his inaugural lecture that English literature has now a triple function, that is, to delight and instruct us, but also and above all, to save our souls and heal the state. As religion progressively ceases to provide the social cement, effective values, and basic mythologies by which a socially turbulent class society can be welded together, English is constructed as a subject to carry this ideological burden from the Victorian period onwards. Now, the key figure of the Victorian era is Matthew Arnold. He recognized the urgent social need to Hellenize or cultivate the Philistine middle class who have proved unable to underpin their political and economic power with a suitably rich and subtle ideology. This can be done by transfusing into them something of the traditional style of aristocracy, who, as Arnold shrewdly perceives as ceasing to be the dominant class in England, but to have something of the ideological wherewithal to lend a hand to their middle-class masters. Matthew Arnold is considered to be refreshingly unhypocritical. Now, literature was in several ways a suitable candidate for this ideological enterprise. As a liberal humanizing pursuit, it could provide a potent antidote to political bigotry and ideological extremism. English, as a Victorian handbook for English teachers, helps to promote sympathy and fellow feeling among all classes. Literature would rehearse the masses in the habits of pluralistic thought and feeling, persuading them to acknowledge that more than one viewpoint than theirs existed, namely that of their masters. It would communicate to them the moral riches of bourgeois civilization, impress upon them a reverence for middle-class achievements, and since reading is an essentially solitary, contemplative activity, curb in them any disruptive tendency to collective political action. Secondly, literature would give them a pride in their national language and literature. Furthermore, like religion, literature works primarily by emotion and experience, and so was admirably well fitted to carry through the ideological task which religion left off. Literature from Arnold onwards is the enemy of ideological dogma. Even so, it was not the business of literature to communicate such beliefs directly, that is, to argue openly. But rather, literature should convey timeless truths, thus distracting the masses from their immediate commitments, nurturing in them a spirit of tolerance and generosity, and so ensuring the survival of private property. It is significant, then, that English as an academic subject was first institutionalized not in the universities, but in the mechanics institutes, working men's colleges, and extension lecturing circuits. Now we have here the English as an academic subject in the feminine aspect and the masculine aspect. First, in the feminine aspect, English was literally the poor man's classics, that is, a way of providing a cheapish liberal education for those beyond the charmed circles of public school and Oxbridge. Secondly, the softening and humanizing effects of English are within the existing ideological stereotypes of gender clearly feminine. And thirdly, the rise of English in England ran parallel to the gradual grudging admission of women to the institutions of higher education. And since English was an untaxing sort of affair, concerned with the finer feelings rather than with the more virile topics of bona fide academic disciplines, it seemed a convenient sort of non-subject to palm off on the ladies who were in any case excluded from science and the professions. Now, in the masculine aspect, if English had its feminine aspect, however, it also acquired a masculine one as the century drew on. The era of the academic establishment of English is also the era of high imperialism in England. As British capitalism became threatened and progressively outstripped by its younger German and American rivals, the squalid undignified scramble of too much capital chasing too few overseas territories, which was to culminate in 1914 in the First Imperialist World War, created the urgent need for a sense of national cohesion and identity. Now, what was at stake in English studies was less English literature than English literature. Now, moving on, we have here Frank Raymond Lewis. Far from constituting some amateur or impressionistic enterprise, English was an arena in which the most fundamental questions of human existence, such as what it meant to be a person, to engage in significant relationship with others, and to live from the vital center of the most essential values, were thrown into vivid relief and made the object of the most intensive scrutiny. Scrutiny was the title of the critical journal launched in 1932 by the Lewises. F.R. Lewis resisted scholarly approach of elites in literary studies which mindlessly privileged taste. In the face of such whimsical taste, they stressed the centrality of rigorous critical analysis, a disciplined attention to the words on the page. They urged this not simply for technical or aesthetic reasons, but because it had the closest relevance to the spiritual crisis of modern civilization. Literature was important not only in itself, but because it encapsulated creative energies which were everywhere in the defensive in modern commercial society. F.R. Lewis insisted that how one evaluated literary works was deeply bound up with deeper judgments about the nature of history and society as a whole. Scrutiny was not just a journal, but the focus of a moral and cultural crusade. Its adherents would go out to the schools and universities to do battle there, nurturing through the study of literature the kind of rich, complex, mature, discriminating, morally serious responses which would equip individuals to survive in a mechanized society of trashy romances, alienated labor, banal advertisements, and vulgarizing mass media. Now, furthermore, there is the Lewisian belief in essential Englishness. Its conviction that some kinds of English were more English than others was a kind of petty bourgeois version of the upper-class chauvinism which had helped to bring English to birth in the first place. English as a subject was in part the offshoot of a gradual shift in class tone within English culture. That is, Englishness was less a matter of imperialist flag-waving than of country dancing, including rural, populist, and provincial, rather than metropolitan and aristocratic. Now, this whole notion of language rested upon a naive mimeticism. That is, the theory was that words are somehow healthiest when they approach the condition of things and thus cease to be words at all. Language is alienated or degenerate unless it is crammed within the physical textures of actual experience, plumbed with the rank juices of real life. Armed with this trust in essential Englishness, Latinate or verbally disembodied writers could be shown the door and pride of place assigned to the dramatically concrete. In 1915, Thomas Stearns Eliot had come to London. Culturally displaced and spiritually disinherited, Eliot arrived in England and in what has rightly been described as the most ambitious feat of cultural imperialism the century seems likely to produce, began to carry out a wholesale salvage and demolition job on its literary traditions. Somewhere in the 17th century, a dissociation of sensibility set in. That is, thinking was no longer like smelling, language drifted loose from experience, and the upshot was the literary disaster of John Milton, who anesthetized the English language into an arid ritual. It was not until the appearance of Eliot that English literature began to recuperate. What Eliot was in fact assaulting was the whole ideology of middle-class liberalism, the official ruling ideology of industrial capitalist society. This includes liberalism, romanticism, Protestantism, economic individualism, all of which he considered as perverted dogmas of those expelled from the happy garden of the organic society. Eliot's own solution is an extreme right-wing authoritarianism where men and women must sacrifice their petty personalities and opinions to an impersonal order. And furthermore, we have here the concept of practical criticism and close reading. Lewis' name is closely associated with practical criticism and Close reading. Practical criticism meant a method which spurned belletristic waffle and was properly unafraid to take the text apart, but it also assumed that you could judge literary greatness and centrality by bringing a focused attentiveness to bear on poems or pieces of prose isolated from their cultural and historical contexts. On the other hand, close reading meant detailed analytic interpretation, providing a valuable antidote to aestheticist chit-chat, but it also seemed to imply that every previous school of criticism had read only an average of 3 words per line. To call for close reading, in fact, is to do more than insist on due attentiveness to the text. It inescapably suggests an attention to this rather than to something else, that is, to the words on the page rather than to the context which produced and surrounded them. Next, we have Ivor Armstrong Richards. A major link between Cambridge English and the American New Criticism was the work of the Cambridge critic I.A. Richards. If Leavis sought to redeem criticism by converting it into something approximating a religion, thus carrying on the work of Matthew Arnold, Richards sought in his works of the 1920s to lend it a firm basis in the principles of a hard-nosed scientific psychology. Society is in crisis, as Richards argues, because historical change and scientific discovery in particular has outstripped and devalued the traditional mythologies by which men and women have lived. Poetry, as Richards remarks with stunning offhandedness, is capable of saving us, and it is a perfectly possible means of overcoming chaos. Like Arnold, he advances literature as a conscious ideology for reconstructing social order and does so in the socially disruptive, economically decaying, politically unstable years which followed the Great War. And lastly, Richards claims that modern science is the model of true knowledge, but emotionally it leaves something to be desired. Now, the American New Criticism, which flourished from the late 1930s to the 1950s, is generally taken to encompass the work of Eliot, Richards, and perhaps also Leavis and William Empson, as well as number of leading American literary critics as follows. The ideology of New Criticism began to crystallize, that is, the scientific rationalism was ravaging the aesthetic life of the Old South, human experience was being stripped of its sensuous particularity, and poetry was a possible solution. This was the ideology of an uprooted, defensive intelligentsia who reinvented in literature what they could not locate in reality. The literary text for American New Criticism, as for I.A. Richards, was therefore grasped in what might be called functionalist terms. Coherence and integration were the keynotes. New Criticism, in other words, stopped short of a full-blooded formalism, awkwardly tempering it with a kind of empiricism, a belief that the poem's discourse somehow included reality within itself. Now finally, we have here William Empson. William Empson is sometimes included in New Criticism, but he is in fact much more interestingly read as a remorseless opponent of their major doctrines. What makes Empson seem a new critic is his lemon-squeezing style of analysis, that is, the breathtaking offhand ingenuity with which he unravels ever finer nuances of literary meaning. Whereas New Criticism sunders the text from rational discourse and a social context, Empson insists on treating poetry as a species of ordinary language capable of being rationally paraphrased, a type of utterance in continuity with our usual ways of speaking and acting. So the literary work for Empson is open-ended, which implies that understanding it involves grasping the general contexts in which words are socially used, rather than simply tracing patterns of internal verbal coherence, and such contexts are always likely to be indeterminate. Now, thank you very much for listening. That is all for my discussion. I hope you understand everything I have discussed here.